this is an exciting webinar series on e-commerce. We are doing this together with Michael Beavis at the Denver Economic and Development Opportunity, as well as Carrie Singer from the Commons on Champa. And I will introduce myself real quick. Then Carrie can introduce herself, and then Michael can introduce himself, and he's one that's going to be talking most today. So we have Green Hat Web Solutions. We do a lot with e-commerce websites, both WordPress and Shopify. And we've been in business for 10 years. We're based in Denver. And we really enjoy doing things here with the public. Before the COVID lockdowns, we were doing it at the Commons on Champa, which is a really great place. And Carrie can talk about that as well. And we highly recommend their services. And this is just an opportunity for us to get to know people. This is a great series of webinars on e-commerce, and they are totally free. This is kind of like just a way of us giving back to the community. And so with that said, then maybe I'll turn it over to Carrie and you can introduce yourself.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you so much, Ryan. As Ryan mentioned, my name is Carrie Singer, and I work alongside Michael Beavis with the Denver Economic Development and Opportunity Organization, so one of your local city departments. The city co-founded the Commons on Champa a little over 5 years ago. I'm going to post information about the Commons in the chat, but basically the Commons opened its doors really to be that public hub for entrepreneurship, where aspiring entrepreneurs have access to one-on-one business advising, as well as a plethora of workshops and startup programs. So there's a lot that you can take advantage of free of charge, regardless of your industry, regardless of your stage of business. There genuinely is something for everyone. And we partner very closely with BizBoost at the Denver Public Library. So it's great to have Jay on our call as well today. The other thing that I'll mention very briefly is Denver Economic Development and Opportunity has a handful of tools and resources available for Denver-based businesses. And those include tax credit incentive programs, small business lending, access to workforce resources, as well as certifications if you're looking to do work with the government. So I just wanted to give that quick commercial as well. So we've partnered with Green Hat Web Solutions for many, many years, and they're just a really fantastic power partner of ours. So look forward to this session today.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Carrie. Okay, so Michael, it's now your turn. So why don't you introduce yourself and then tell everyone how to create an e-commerce business.
Great. Thanks, and thanks for the invite to do this. And as Carrie mentioned, Carrie and I work together through the Office of Economic Development and Opportunity here in Denver. And she always does a fabulous job of highlighting just a small, tiny fraction of the things that we do at the Commons on Champa. But we always say that if you're starting up, you should start at the Commons, because that's how we connect businesses at any stage of the journey to the resources that they need in order to be successful and thrive here in Denver. And fun fact about Green Hat Web Solutions is that I coincidentally happen to be an entrepreneur and run my own e-commerce business. And I learned a lot of the tips and tricks that I currently implement today from Green Hat Web Solutions before I started working for the city of Denver when I was still in the higher education space. So kind of a fun fact there. So this class, I'm gonna breeze through some information quickly and then leave as much time as possible really to answer individual questions. We have a good turnout here today, and I like to see that. And I want to make sure that we're addressing some of the basic questions that many of you on this call have about how to kind of move your business forward. So I know that some of the folks on this call haven't yet established a business, and that's really what the intention of this call is going to be and the presentation is going to be today. But then I want to leave some time for individuals that are on there already, that have already established some things, and touch on some things that you're just getting your feet wet in. And then if you looked at the agenda that we have for the upcoming webinar series as well, you'll see how we'll kind of dive into topics a little bit deeper. Which platforms are better? How do you set up SEO better? How do you brand the page so that it's consistent across different platforms and things like that? So we'll get into some of those topics a little bit later. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just bring up a presentation that I use very frequently. And it's old, but it's still extremely relevant. And I'm just going to touch on a couple of key points. So just a little bit of background about myself. As I mentioned to you, I'm an entrepreneur. I oversee innovation and entrepreneurship here for the city of Denver. I was in the higher education space for a long time, managing programs across half the country. Actually, and prior to that, I was a banker and a finance guy for a long time, where I was coaching and mentoring businesses to structure their businesses properly so they could get some financing that they needed in the business space. So I've been here in Denver now for about 6 years and loving it and getting outside every day. So I'm going to skip past a couple of these slides about the personalities needed to be an entrepreneur, and whether or not you have what it takes, or you have the grit, the stamina to get into it. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the pathway that you typically experience as an early stage entrepreneur, right? So you have an idea, and you're not sure if it should be a business. You're not sure where to get started, et cetera. That's where kind of the Commons comes into play. Carrie and I, as well as some of our colleagues, offer advisory hours and some mentorship through the Commons. And there's a ton of programming, most of which is low or no cost to you to participate in, just to kind of help move the needle a little bit forward and kind of shape up the idea with turning your passion into a business if that's what it happens to be. So Carrie and I kind of work with businesses at all stages of the journey, as I mentioned. So all the way from, I have an idea, kind of, sort of, maybe I'm not sure if this should be a business, to we even work with some of the larger, Fortune 500 type companies that say, hey, we hear Denver's a hot spot in the country and we want to come relocate an office there. We can help those businesses along the way. There. So typically when you're thinking about setting up a business, and these concepts really apply both for physical businesses as well as, e-commerce related businesses, but we got to get started somewhere, right? And so the first thing that we like to focus on is really understanding the structure of business that you want to create, right? So typically what we're talking about here is, should you be a sole proprietorship? Should you be an LLC? Should you be a C Corp? Should you be a nonprofit? Whatever the case happens to be. And the answer to that question typically boils down to these 3 bullets that you see here on the slide. And what we want to be able to answer for ourselves is, we're talking about the control, liability, and taxes, right? And so when we talk about control for the business, we talk about, we're looking at ownership. Right. So from a sole proprietorship standpoint, that's typically one individual, who's could be making a widget, could be, serving as an intermediary, or a connector, if you will, for selling products on a web-based platform, as an example. But it's typically you solely as the individual owner of the business. Now, the one benefit to that is that it's just you. It's super easy and simple to set up this type of business, and I'll get into this a little bit later in the presentation. But oftentimes, if you're a sole proprietorship, you don't typically have to register for a separate employer identification number, or what we call an EIN, or a taxpayer identification number, a TIN. And that's because you get to use your own social security number as your tax filing purposes for any revenue that's generated as a sole proprietorship. Now, when you look at a sole proprietorship, the risk factor comes down into number 2, right? Because what we're not creating with a sole proprietorship is that separation of personal assets and business assets, right? So again, it depends on the type of business that you are and how big you want the business to become. But think from the concept of, if you make a physical product, as an example, and you sell it out into the world, and somebody injures themselves and they try to blame you or your product for the cause of the injury, they can come back and not only sue your sole proprietorship business, but sue you personally and your personal assets, which means your house, your car, your savings, all those kinds of things. And so we typically want to create a layer of separation there from a liability standpoint. And we start to see this separation take place when we get into LLCs and C Corps. Okay. And then when you file one of those types of businesses, you're typically registering for an EIN or a TIN number to create a separate entity for purposes of creating that business. And then, of course, third is taxes. So I'm going to go through each of the primary structures of business as we address each one of these types of things. And just to kind of lay it out there for you to think about how you want to structure your business. Now, it's not uncommon to see businesses start out, especially small businesses, start out as one entity and then transition into a different entity as it gets deeper down the road. Okay. So again, with the sole proprietorship, it's 100% ownership of you, the individual Social Security owner and possessor. Again, I mentioned the liability piece. From a tax purpose standpoint, it's really not too much different, because any money that's made through the business passes through to you as an individual taxpayer, and you pay income tax typically at your individual tax bracket rate for whatever revenues generated through that business and reported under that Social Security number. Okay. When we talk about an LLC, which is typically the most common type of business that you see being set up here, because it's super simple to do. And what we talk about with an LLC stands for Limited Liability Corporation. Okay, you might hear terms like LLP, Limited Liability Partnership. Those are typically entities that you see for like large accounting firms or management firms that are doing consulting and things like that. And all of the members of the partnership have equal responsibility associated with that. Now, with a limited liability corporation, it's technically its own separate entity. So again, we are registering for an EIN number in the case of an LLC. And from a control standpoint, what that means is an LLC can be one individual, or it can be dozens of individuals, depending on how you structure the business and what you do. And you make that structure happen through something known as an operating agreement. And so this is just a legal document. You can find templates of them on the internet, or you can, we highly encourage you to seek legal counsel to help you craft something that's a little bit more detailed and protects all the parties in the agreement from just stuff that you don't think about might happen is going to happen, right? And the most common for this is, you start a business with your friends or your family, and everybody gets really excited, and we've been friends since childhood, and we've never had a fight, and everything's going to be great. Well, fair warning, that typically changes, especially when money gets involved and business responsibilities get involved. So it's highly recommended that you get an operating agreement in place. And the operating agreement will primarily list who's owners in the company and what percentage of ownership they have of the company. It could be 1%, it could be 70%, whatever the amount is that all the parties agree upon. It will also list in there who's made contributions to the business as far as initial capital and things of that nature, which typically ties back to percentage of ownership or equity. And it will list, things out like who has what day-to-day responsibilities in the business, right? So oftentimes, again, if it's a couple of friends that got together and started a business, they typically split things 50-50, or if one person put in more money than the other, maybe it's a 60-40, whatever the case is. but it will also list out the day-to-day responsibilities. So-and-so is really good with the numbers and the finances. So they have the title of the CFO, and they handle all the financial transactions of the business. And so is really great at customer relationships and doing sales. And so that will be listed out in the operating agreement, just to again, provide some clear guidelines and some responsibilities there. It will also list things about what happens in the event of, if one member wants to step away from the business, or sell their portion of it, or whatever the case is. So an operating agreement is much different than a shareholder agreement, because in an LLC, we're not issuing shares. We typically see that in an S Corp or C Corp, where you actually issue shares, right? We'll initially issue 1 million shares of a company that's not necessarily worth any value, but they're shares nonetheless. And one person owns 60% of those shares and one person owns 40% of those shares. And then those shares get diluted and sold out as the company raises capital. So operating agreements are different than shareholder agreements. So that's just important for you to do that. But nonetheless, what we're laying out here in the operating agreement is who has control and who has what responsibilities. Then number 2 for an LLC is liability. So again, we've created that separation of liability there. So back to the scenario, if somebody attempts to sue the business for wrongdoing or some type of fault, the individual owners of that LLC are primarily protected from any personal lawsuits and things of that nature that could result from that. So you're protecting your personal assets from that, and that's critically important as the business continues to grow and expand. So you want to be thinking of that. There's certain things that you want to be very aware of when you do that, and especially early stage businesses. What happens is you tend to be funding the business out of personal monies that you have to contribute to the business. It's very important for you to set up proper accounting practices early on for the business so that you don't have personal money going in and out for different expenses without proper traction, right? So as an example, if you need to contribute $1,000 to the business for this month's expenses, you want to do that in a clean fashion instead of saying, well, I went and put gas in the car and that's a business expense. And then I bought some items from the Party City for an event that we're doing. And I use my personal credit card for that, but I'll just reimburse myself from the business later, because that creates it's actually, the term is called piercing the veil from a liability perspective. So there's some loopholes in there. If somebody does try to sue your business and you're doing transactions in that fashion, it could cause you to be at risk for personal liability associated with business fault. So just be real clear and careful about that. And then from a tax perspective, on an LLC, LLCs are what they refer to as a pass-through entity. So what that means is that any money that's made in the LLC passes through to the individual owners of that LLC and gets reported on their personal income tax return. So my business is an LLC, as an example. Any profits that are made from the business at the end of the year, or losses as it might be, get reported on a form that they call a Schedule C. And it just basically shows the profit and loss activity of the business. And whatever that bottom line figure is, gets either added or deducted from my personal tax return. And that's just because it's considered a pass-through entity. The government doesn't make us fill out tons of tedious and laborsome tax forms. When you get into S Corps and C Corps, the tax forms and/or nonprofits, nonprofits file a different form, but the process is still relatively simple. But S Corps and C Corps have to fill out full-blown tax returns, and it's a lot more complicated. So pass-through entity makes it really nice and simple. From a tax filing standpoint, you typically aren't filing a separate tax return, and therefore not paying separate filing fees for that. So going back up to the top again now with C Corps, which is the other most common type of business that we see here. This is typically recommended for companies that will be raising a substantial amount of capital early on in the business process, because again, there's kind of this shareholder agreement that's created in the structure of it, and a lot of outside investors typically prefer C corps because that's what their standard kind of legal documents and agreements that they work with other businesses on. They're written in that language, and so therefore it kind of aligns everything to their common practices. But as far as the next two pieces on here, the liability piece, a C corp creates that same level of separation and liability protection for you as a business owner as an LLC does. And so again, it's a great way to protect personal assets and lay out all the agreements of who has what responsibilities and who's contributed what amounts of capital to the business, and so on and so forth. From a tax perspective, as I mentioned, you're going to have a lot more complicated tax forms to fill out, and you'll typically be working with an accountant on a full-time regular basis to do that. Now, again, you can structure your business as one entity in the beginning and then transfer it into something else. So it's not uncommon to see people, especially, and I'm going to use this example. I think it was Tasha that said she had a business that she was thinking about running some sales through Etsy, right? So oftentimes you see Etsy as a great platform, especially for makers and for craft related type businesses that are building kind of a personal culture around the products and services that they sell. It's very common to see like a sole proprietorship started in that model, and if things really start to take off, on Etsy as an example, and maybe you expand to a couple of other platforms, you definitely want to start really giving some hard consideration to moving that business into an LLC. And then oftentimes you see LLCs that will down the road, especially as they raise some additional capital, convert into a C corp. And C corps are the types of businesses that you see that are publicly traded. All those businesses are registered as C corps. So very common practice to do that. The process to set up those businesses is very simple, right? So again, I apologize for the outdated slides and the branding at the bottom, and not San Diego. But basically how we're going to start this process is you're going to simply go to the Secretary of State for whatever state you want to register your business in. Now, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it was common practice that everybody would look for the state that was the cheapest to register their business in, and then they would register in Delaware as an example. But they would operate in Colorado or wherever else that they wanted to operate. You don't need to do that necessarily anymore because the process to register the business is super simple and relatively inexpensive. So here, basically in the state of Colorado, so you're going to go to the Secretary of State of Colorado, and right on the front page, it is, in fact, I'm just going to show you that screenshot because that's easier to look at than my slide that I have up here. But I gotta move you. Sorry. So right on the front screen here, you're going to go into this section for businesses. It's normally on the front, right here in business. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to search the business database. And there you're going to type in the name that you want for your business. And you're going to just make sure that it doesn't already exist in the state in which you're going to register the business. And it'll say it's available. And then there's two options that will come up. One will be for you to hold the name of the business, and you pay a small fee. I think it's $20 to hold the business, or $25 to hold the business. And you can hold it, I think, for a period of up to 6 months. And the only reason you would do that is because you're not quite ready to establish the business and kind of move forward with things. But when you're ready to register the business, the total cost to register the business is about $50. So you're going to pay the $25 up front to hold it, and then $50 to actually make the name yours. Or you could just pay $50 now to make the name yours permanently. And then every year you pay a $5 renewal fee. So it's not terribly expensive to do that. On the site, if you're considering using, registering your business as a sole proprietorship, it will list basically 7 criteria that you have to meet in order to classify as a sole proprietorship. They're pretty basic and straightforward. And so you can easily review those questions and say, does that fit me or does it not fit me? If you have to answer no to any one of those 7 questions, then you should consider being an LLC. And again, always be thinking about that liability piece standpoint. So nonprofits also fall into this category, right? So you're going to go through this process as well. And going back to the 3 aspects for nonprofits, it is its own separate entity. You do file for its own separate taxpayer ID number at the state level and the federal level. And I'll get into that in just a minute. And then from a liability perspective, again, it typically creates separation because there's not straightforward ownership like you have in an LLC or an S Corp in a nonprofit. And from a tax standpoint, the idea behind nonprofits or not-for-profits is that you're not paying taxes at the end of the year because the money that's being generated to support the nonprofit is being spent out in programming and resources needed to operate the nonprofit. The tax filing standpoint, a nonprofits file a single form every year called a 990. Pretty simple form. It says how much did the nonprofit bring in donations and revenue, and how much did the nonprofit spend? And at the end, it should equal 0. So pretty straightforward, but you still would go on this process to register the business, the name of the business, and then that means that you own that business entity within that state. Now, if you have a business concept or an idea that you're thinking is going to fit well into, say, a franchise model, right? You want the name of your business to be represented across the entire United States in a variety of states, and whether it be a consulting practice or a restaurant, storefront facing, something like that, you might want to poke around in some other states' Secretary of State's websites to see if those names exist there. Because remember, when you're searching here, all you're searching for is that business name within this state of Colorado. Doesn't mean you can't operate your business in other states, but if you're really keen on building a brand around your name for your business, and you want that to be represented across the state, you want to make sure that that name is going to be available for you in those states. But that's something to look at kind of down the road. So anyway, you go on here and you click through and you fill out, file a business document. Super simple in the process. Is for a new record, LLC or S Corp. Again, it lists all the different types that are here for you to consider, and you simply go on and fill out the form. It probably takes 10 minutes or less for you to complete the form. Now, what happens is, again, you're registered within the state of Colorado, but you still need to generate an EIN number for your LLC. And so then you're going to simply go to irs.gov, and you're going to do the same thing for registering a business there and apply. And typically it takes about 2 weeks for them to issue you an EIN number. Once you have the EIN number, you can then go to the bank and open a banking account, as an example, because you're going to need that information for, again, tax reporting purposes and establishing your bank account. Again, if you're doing it a sole proprietorship, you can use your own social security number, but you still need to come in with the paperwork from the state and the feds in the federal government to show that you're a registered business in both of those entities. So that's kind of the typical process that you go through. Again, Carrie and I can help with that. We have some tips and some tools. If some of the stuff didn't stick, we're always happy to connect and support in that way. I was thinking of something else I was going to share, and I can't remember what it was now. But with that, I'm trying to get, here we go. Trying to get back to my stop sharing so I can see if there's any questions or anything. So that's kind of the basic, simple process to get the business established. Now we've established the business and we're talking about e-commerce businesses. Then kind of your next step would be to go on and choose which web platform you typically want to do for shopping and selling tools. And Ryan and his team will talk, and we'll be talking in the coming weeks about the differences between the two primary platforms that most e-commerce businesses use is some kind of web platform, right? So you're looking at like a WordPress or some other type of platform, and you've seen some of these do it yourselfer platforms like a Wix or a webs.com or something like that. And those are typically fine. They have some limited capabilities as far as shopping tools. So the WordPress is probably one of the most common platforms. It has a lot of customization and ability for you to build some things out, and does require a little bit of tech savviness, but not a ton. And then the other, and through WooCommerce, you can have what they call plugins. And on the plugins, you're going to use a tool like WooCommerce. And WooCommerce is basically your shopping cart that you're going to use for your web platform itself. And or the other tool is Shopify. And Shopify is, again, there's other options out there, but these are kind of the two most common. And Shopify is also very simple in kind of a plug and play concept. They have templates that you use, and you can pick your themes, et cetera, to build out your platform, list your products, and these kinds of things. And so once you have that out there, again, then you start promoting it through a variety of methods, and we will be getting into that as this kind of series of classes progresses there. But there's things that you need to keep in mind. So again, I have a website. My product, as an example, I sell all over the world. And I promote that through a variety of different ways, but how I report out my taxes is really important, right? And again, there's tools and plugins that you can use for both of those platforms that will help you track where those sales are occurring, because you have to pay sales tax where those products were sold. Now, we talked about setting up the business, both registering it with the state of Colorado as well as registering it with the federal government. The next step then would, especially if you're selling physical products, is for you then to go and register the business as a tax-paying entity for sales tax entity within the city and the state, right? So I have to register my business to pay city sales tax in Denver for any products that were sold within Denver. And then I also have to pay a state tax there. And again, you can do those both of those online right now. They're pretty simple to do. Prior to COVID, you could simply walk into the office locations that were both based here in Denver, pay a small fee. I want to say it was like $30 or less to register, and you get your sales tax license. And typically how it works with smaller businesses is there's kind of this progressive journey, right? You put out your website. Again, if you're making a physical product or you have a niche type product, you align yourself to a maker's market or something like that, where you can physically go and set up a booth. When you set up a booth in some of those markets, they'll ask you for your sales tax license for that particular city or county that market is taking place in. So either the market coordinator will set that up for you, or ask you to show the certificate that's generated that shows that you have a sales tax license in that particular city or county where that market's being held. So that's kind of the basics. I don't want to get too deep down the rabbit hole of starting to talk about promotion and sales and those kinds of things, but I would like to pause for a moment and see if there's any questions that I can answer for anybody.
Michael, this is Jay. You mentioned just in your last little bit there about the taxes for the booth. Is that a virtual booth like for Etsy or something like that? Is that what you mean? And then is the taxing for where you are located, you said, or the market
Yeah.
Sorry, explain that a little bit more.
Yeah,
if you
sure. Thanks for pointing that out, Jay. So I was referring to physical markets. This was obviously in a pre-COVID world. So for here in Denver, some of the bigger what they call makers markets, right, is like the Denver Bazaar, or a holiday event that they hold in a large venue, where there's beer trucks and you can shop, local producers of products and these kinds of things. And the sales tax license for those physical types of markets needs to be in the city and county of that market is taking place. So I know that we have a gentleman on here from Boulder as an example. And so maybe he's making a physical product, but he wants to come down to, and he's got all his registrations that he needs in Boulder. So he's registered with the state, he's registered with the feds, he's registered for his sales tax license in Boulder, so he can set up a booth or a shop on the Pearl Street, downtown Pearl Street as an example for a festival. But now he wants to expand it. He wants to come to Denver. He needs to get a separate sales tax license for Denver. And where that event is going to take place. Now, the way I've seen it typically set up is that typically the event organizer will say, hey, you want to register to participate in our Denver Bazaar? Here's all the things we need to see from you. And they're typically, what they'll require is for you to prove that you're a registered business within the state and that you have a federal taxpayer ID number. They'll require you to show that you have liability insurance. And oftentimes, if you don't have liability insurance, the event organizer will give you a link to a group that they work with that says, for $30, you have liability insurance that covers the event. And that's so if you have a booth and somebody trips over a wire that runs to your booth or your tablecloth or whatever else, you're protected from them suing you from that standpoint. And then they'll say, and you need to have your sales tax license. So again, you show them the certificate of what the license looks like, and they accept that. Or the event organizer will say, we're taking care of the sales tax for you, and therefore it's an extra $5 or whatever it is that they're going to charge you on top of that. And then you have to report out to the event organizer at the end of the event how many sales you had for the event, and then they will report out your sales tax for you. So that's how that works typically. Other questions?
Hey, Michael, it's Diane. You mentioned having some plugins for the sales tax that would translate back to a website. Do you have any specific examples of some of those plugins? Because when you are trying to do this, not in the specific location, like a Denver Merchandise Mart,
yep,
doing it online, you are going to have to deal with all the 50 states that you're going to try to sell in. And so that's just a little bit overwhelming for some of us that are just starting. So I just didn't know if there was any that you might recommend for.
Yeah. So there's a couple out there. The one that's probably the most common and most popular is the one I use. It's called TaxJar. And it's a plugin. It works on both platforms that I mentioned. And every time, so like I use Shopify. I recently converted my site, and I'll talk more about this in upcoming webinars, but I converted my site from a I keep saying WooCommerce, a WordPress site to a Shopify site. And they work very similar. It's just a personal preference for me on that one. But there's a widget that you add to your Shopify account that's called TaxJar, and it will track all the sales that you have anywhere in the United States, and it will track the tax rate. So what's nice about it is that in your shopping cart, when your customer checks out, it will calculate the sales tax automatically based on their zip code. And then at the end of the year or at the end of the quarter, you can go into Shopify and generate a report that says, gee, how much money do I owe Podunk, Texas, this little town in Texas where I know I had some sales this year. And it'll calculate that for you, and you write a check and you send it off to the tax office down in that particular city and county. So it's still a fair amount of work, especially if you're doing a lot of sales in a lot of different cities, but over time it just becomes a little more streamlined. through that process. But tax jar is the one that's most common and the one I'm most familiar with.
Really curious. I hate to ask a follow-up on that. Are you actually then required to register in the state of Texas? With a sales tax license to actually be able to collect those?
Yep. So tax questions they're a little bit tricky, right? And so my answer to those is always it depends, right? And full disclosure, I'm not a tax accountant, but the general rule of thumb typically is that you don't really have to start getting super concerned with how legitimate you are, I'm going to say, until your tax liability starts to become greater than, say, $600, right? So if you're selling product, even if I sell $1,000 worth of product down into Texas, as an example, my tax liability is not $600.
Right.
And so when my tax liability starts to get greater than $600, in theory, right, you'd have more consistency of knowing that you're selling into that particular county or region. And it would be advisable, certainly, for you to get registered and set everything up properly there. But $600 is a pretty hefty tax liability standpoint, especially for starting early stage businesses.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Other questions?
I have a question about, so I already turned my business into LLC, but I'm realizing that I probably should be sole proprietorship. Do you know if there's any ways to change that, or do I just have to continue as an LLC?
Sure, you can change it. So my first question to you would be, why do you want to change it? Thinking about those first three things that I covered, right? Control, liability being the biggest one, and taxes. Because from the standpoint of a sole proprietorship versus an LLC, there's no tax advantage for you, right? Because it's all your income anyway. So because remember that LLC is a pass-through entity. Control is not altered from a sole proprietorship to an LLC because you can still claim 100% ownership of an LLC. So the only thing you're giving up is that liability protection. So that's why I would ask you why you want to switch it back.
Well, I was discovering that it's much more expensive to have an LLC than sole proprietorship, especially when you're just starting out. You haven't made that income that you want to make, basically.
And I would disagree with that. And I understand that that's a lot of people's perceptions. To register a sole proprietorship is not less expensive than registering an LLC when you're registering with the state. And because you're not having to submit a separate tax return for your LLC at the end of the year, it's not more expensive for you to file taxes. So there really is no greater expense. If there is, it's definitely less than $100 throughout the entire year. So that's just something I would just have you think through a little bit. You need to make the decision that's right for you. But the answer to your question is, if you wanted to make that change, again, you just simply go back to the Secretary of State's website. And there's a section there under that business section where it says update forms. And one of the forms is to change the business entity type. And you'll pay, I think it's like $10 to register that form. But then you also have to go back to the irs.gov site and update the status there as well. Now, the irs.gov doesn't charge you anything to register your business as a sole proprietorship, an LLC, a C Corp, whatever the case is. And they're not charging you to get an EIN number issued for your LLC business. So you can go back onto both of those sites and you can change the structure of that business however you'd like.
Okay. I also was getting some forms, I had to have certain things in my home. I guess they think that I have an office of people or whatever. So they're you have to have that workers' right compensation poster displayed all the time, this other kind of stuff, or you might get fined for $1,000 or whatever. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, Tasha. It's the answer to what you're talking about is what you're receiving is spam mail. And you're going to get a lot of that when you register a business. So when you're getting solicitations for you to buy posters to put in your break room, and with threats that say you're going to get fined if this is not displayed properly in your break room, those are their spam solicitations, and you'll get a lot. And they're really, unfortunately, they're really savvy about how they structure the mailers or the emails that they send you, because they look very official. But if you look on the fine print, typically in the margins of anything that comes in your mailbox or any email, that they're required by law to disclose that they are not affiliated with any government agency. So that's kind of your tell that they're not legitimate. If you're a sole owner of an LLC, nobody's going to come knocking on your door and fine you because you don't have posters sitting up next to your kitchen table. I can assure you of that. So you're right. They do hit you up a lot, and there's a lot of things that they'll say, like, your business isn't registered on this particular site or whatever the case is. You just have to be really diligent about reading all the fine print on those things. It's very, very rare that the federal government or the local state governments will send you information in the mail that you need to pay additional fees and or fill out additional personal identification information. So I would highly caution you to kind of just discard those things when they come in.
Okay, so like labor poster compliance, I can just throw that away. Okay, thank you for that, because I was confused and I was upset.
Yeah.
So thank you.
And you don't, and that's not, I mean, you would have registered that as a sole proprietorship, you still probably would have got that junk mail.
Okay.
Yeah. Other questions?
Very good conversations here, Michael. What would you say is maybe one of the most common misunderstandings or misconceptions about starting an e-commerce business? Maybe you or Carrie could respond to that in your experience.
Yeah, I'll let Carrie chime in too, but probably for me, the most common misconceptions are that it's really hard or that it's super easy, right? I feel like it's kind of right in the middle, and it's, yes. I mean, especially if you're tech savvy, you can go on and build a website in 10 minutes, right? On one of these kind of pre-canned platforms. Does it function the way it needs to function? Are you building, legitimacy for your brand and building something that customers can trust in that process? Probably not. Is it complicated and too overwhelming for somebody who's not tech savvy to build an e-commerce business? Absolutely not. I would consider myself a non-tech savvy person, and everything associated with my business I built. I'm not saying it's the best, but it functions, and I have a strong following for my product or service. So, Carrie, you have any thoughts around the businesses that we've helped in the past?
Yeah, I don't know if there are any misconceptions that I'll speak to, but what I will say is, this past year that so many people have been working from home and looking to maybe launch a side hustle, now truly is a great time to really kind of push that momentum forward. What I'm finding, certainly our partnership with Green Hat Web Solutions provides a lot of good technical support and information. And I'm hoping all of you have seen the upcoming calendar of webinars that we'll be kind of co-hosting, co-facilitating along with Green Hat. But right now, just from a pure startup perspective, so many organizations, whether they're chambers or industry associations, are hosting kind of free virtual workshops and providing this technical assistance. So much larger than e-commerce, but I just wanted to put that out there that, please take advantage of our business advising if you feel you could benefit, but also, continue doing those kind of Google searches for business support, because there's a lot that one can take advantage of free of charge.
Agree. There's a ton of resources out there. Any other questions? Conrad, you want to share with us a little bit about maybe some business ideas you're bouncing around in your head?
I have thought about getting involved with affiliate marketing and different products that I use, and eventually consolidating some of those products into an e-commerce site. But I was thinking about pursuing a strategy of generating a lot of content, whether a blog or videos or things like that, talking about these different products, and then building out the e-commerce site that way.
Cool. Yep. There's some really great business examples out there that are doing that quite well. And I know we're going to get into some finer detail about that when Ryan and his team talk a little bit about SEO and things like that as an example to help affiliate types models like what you're talking about really thrive and shine in a kind of a crowded space. So I think that's great. Cool. How about Jason or Gerald? Looks like you guys jumped in here after we got started, so we didn't get to quite hear about your ideas, your concepts.
For me, I currently run a online toy store, so done a lot of the groundwork for it. Just mainly looking to kind of take my marketing, SEO, that kind of stuff to the next level.
Great. Very cool. Let's see.
Okay. Gerald, I work for a nonprofit, Make a Chess Move, Macam, and we're launching a Make a Career Move program. Kind of looking to teach youth how to do like social enterprise planning, but really build digital skills. And part of that it would go from them choosing an idea and like 4 basic needs of food, clothing, shelter, and culture.
Okay.
Go through like 3 cohorts, one of like the implementation, 1 product design, and the 3rd product launch. And one part of what we're thinking really is to create an online presence for them.
Okay.
To do that in that shelter kind of part of where it kind of comes of adding on. So it's really teaching e-commerce, going through some of the slide decks, the different kind of parts, and just visualizing those tools. So.
Fantastic. And are you based here in Denver?
Yes, we're based in Denver.
Okay.
Based on the east side in Whittier, 2 blocks from Manual High School, where almost all of our staff went. So
yeah. Okay. Cool. We should
the
connect then offline too. I run some youth entrepreneurship programs.
Perfect.
That'd be a good fit for you on there. I put my contact information here in the chat.
I may have just joined late because our team meeting went over.
Yeah, sure. No problem. No problem.
So I didn't see that meant your chat where your contact info did.
Oh, I just put it in there in the last couple of minutes. So you should see it. It's probably the 4th post up from the bottom.
I got in at 11:56. I just.
Okay. Well, you did just miss it then, so I'll throw it in there. I put it at 11:54, so I'll put it in there.
There we go. Yeah. I'm always 2 minutes late and $1 short.
No worries. But I will. I do encourage anybody on this call to feel free to reach out to me directly. Happy to help. Again, kind of talk through any issues or challenges that you're facing with your business, and would of course encourage you to participate in the rest of the events that we have coming up in this particular series as well. Any other questions? Okay. Well, with that, I guess we're right at the 12 o'clock hour. And I know that Ryan had to pop off to get on another call. I'll hang out here for just a couple more minutes in case anybody has any last final questions. Otherwise, we'll let everybody go and get back to your day, and hopefully we'll see you in our next session.
Hey, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I do have one more question if about marketing.
Yeah.
So would you suggest probably hiring a part-time marketing assistant if you're not really good at that area? I mean, I've been trying and I really don't feel like, that's my forte. And instead of wasting more and more money, I feel like I might as well just hire someone to get it at least set up for me so that I can have something to follow.
So marketing is a topic, it's near and dear to my heart, and I can speak about it all day long. I still teach it at the college level, and it's one of my passion areas. So the short answer to your question, Tasha, and I'd love to connect with you offline outside of this class as well. So please reach out to me so I have your contact info. But a couple of ways you can go about doing that. And so one, especially for early stage startup companies, is to be able to utilize interns from the local universities in an effective manner, because they're looking for real world experience. And oftentimes they're a lot more efficient at the things you're trying to do than you are from a logistical standpoint, right? So social media is one example. I'll just make that up as an example. They live and breathe that stuff all day long. And if that's not your sweet spot, but you're able to clearly articulate a vision to them that they connect with, and you can say, this is really what I want to do, just get out of their way and they'll get it done. And you can typically get interns for low or no cost to your business, because again, they need some examples. They need some real world experience. Oftentimes it's a requirement for their programming that they have to commit a certain number of hours in an internship program. The other option would be for you to, and there's various ways to go about this, but you can hire some freelance marketing people and or marketing teams that will specialize in certain aspects of your marketing strategy that you need to implement. Typically, when we're implementing marketing strategies, we're doing it in phases that build on itself, because if you try to do it all at once, you're not going to be effective in that way. And so there's a variety of ways to connect with your audience. And I have some tools that I would like to share with you that will help you clearly articulate your vision to any early stage marketing support that you're looking to bring in.
That'd be awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
And your email is in here, or should I?
So it's just my name, my first name dot my last name at denvergov.org.
Awesome. And how would I get in contact with the interns? How, is there like
well, you send me an email, I'll send you a link on how you find interns at all the local universities here. I use them all the time for my business.
Okay, definitely will. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Any other questions? All right, we'll let everybody get back to their day. Allie, thanks for keeping the recording going, and we will chat with everybody our next session.
All right, thank you so much.